Beverly Hills 90210 wasn't just a TV show, it was Hollywood's most toxic set. The romance of Brenda Walsh captivated millions, but behind the scenes, Shannen Doherty was being hunted. This wasn't a script decision. It was a calculated corporate plot driven by jealousy and absolute nepotism. While Brenda and Dylan built a billion-dollar empire, a backstage alliance led by the producer's own daughter was quietly orchestrating her execution. This is the unvarnished history of how Hollywood's fragile egos and family power conspired to destroy the greatest teenage icon of the 90s. But this toxic environment didn't happen overnight. It began in the summer of 1990. The Fox network was a relatively new, struggling channel. They desperately needed a hit show to secure their financial future. The producers decided to gamble on a drama about wealthy teenagers living in Beverly Hills. They cast a group of young, mostly unknown actors. Among them was Shannen Doherty, playing the grounded outsider Brenda Walsh, and a young man named Luke Perry, who was brought in to play the lone wolf surfer Dylan McKay. When Shannen and Luke first stepped onto the soundstage together, the dynamic was completely unexpected. The television network had originally planned for the show to be an ensemble piece, where every character shared equal time and focus. But the exact moment Shannen and Luke shared a scene, they broke the corporate blueprint. The chemistry between them was electric, raw, and incredibly authentic. They did not look like two actors reading lines from a script. They looked like two young people who genuinely saw and understood each other. The reason their connection translated so powerfully to the screen was rooted in their real-life backgrounds. Neither of them actually belonged to the wealthy, privileged world of Beverly Hills. Shannen had been a working child actress for years, carrying the heavy financial burden of supporting her career since she was a little girl. She knew the CIEC, old, hard reality of the Hollywood machine. Luke was a blue-collar guy. Before he got the role of Dylan, he was working in construction, literally paving roads to pay his rent. When they looked at each other on set, they recognized a shared working-class survival instinct. They were two outsiders who had suddenly been thrown into the center of a massive corporate experiment. The executives at the Fox network immediately noticed the spark between them. Television executives do not care about authentic human connection. They care about what sells. They looked at the daily footage of Shannen and Luke and saw a gold mine. The writers were immediately ordered to shift the entire focus of the show. Brenda and Dylan were no longer just part of the ensemble. They became the undisputed gravitational center of the series. As the first season aired and transitioned into 1991, the cultural impact was staggering. The show did not just become a hit, it became a global obsession. And at the absolute center of that storm were Shannen Doherty and Luke Perry. Their faces were plastered on every single magazine cover across the country. The network launched a massive, aggressive marketing campaign focused entirely on their romance. If you walked into any store in America, you saw Brenda and Dylan on lunchboxes, on t-shirts, on posters, and in calendars. This level of sudden, extreme fame is incredibly dangerous, and it comes with a severe psychological cost. When you sign a contract with a major television network, you are essentially signing away your basic human freedom. You do not own your face anymore. You do not own your time. The corporation owns you. Shannen and Luke were suddenly working grueling 16-hour days under hot studio lights, only to be pushed into endless weekend press junkets and promotional tours. The network was wringing every single drop of profit out of their physical bodies. They became an independent billion-dollar money-printing machine. Completely separated from the rest of the cast, by their sheer level of fame. But this massive financial success is exactly what planted the poisonous seeds of resentment on the soundstage. In the entertainment industry, when two people suddenly generate all the money and all the attention, the people standing in the background do not applaud. They get deeply, dangerously jealous. Because they were the primary financial assets of the network, Shannen and Luke were placed under a level of intense scrutiny that the other actors simply did not experience. Every time they stepped out in public, they were mobbed by thousands of screaming fans. They could not go to a restaurant or walk down a street without causing a riot. This kind of isolating fame forces two people to lean entirely on each other. Luke quickly became Shannen's only true ally in a world that was rapidly becoming terrifying. On the screen, Dylan McKay was the fiercely protective boyfriend who shielded Brenda from the harsh realities of her new wealthy environment. Off the screen, that dynamic was entirely real. Luke Perry felt a deep, genuine responsibility to protect his co-star. He knew that the Hollywood machine was fundamentally designed to chew up young women and spit them out. He saw how the network executives talked to Shannen, treating her like a highly profitable product rather than a human being. He saw how the relentless media attention was beginning to wear down her nerves. In response, Luke became her safe harbor on the set. During the long, exhausting hours between camera setups, they would sit together in a corner of the sound stage, completely ignoring the noise and the corporate suits surrounding them. They built a private wall around themselves just to survive the pressure. When the directors demanded more passion, more tears, and more energy for the cameras, Shannen and Luke delivered it perfectly because they genuinely trusted each other. The audience sitting at home could feel the weight of T-hat trust. It was the absolute anchor of the show. But as 1991 progressed, the environment outside of their private bubble was turning incredibly hostile. The corporate structure of the television show was fundamentally flawed. The network had built a massive ensemble cast, but they were entirely reliant on just two actors to drive the ratings. The other cast members, who were working the exact same long hours, began to realize that they were easily replaceable. They were essentially just background players in the Brenda and Dylan show. This reality was particularly bitter for the actors who felt they had a special protected status. The Hollywood system is heavily driven by nepotism and family connections. When you have actors on a set who are directly related to the billionaire producers funding the project, the standard rules of a workplace no longer apply. The resentment toward Shannen and Luke's massive popularity began to quietly organize in the dressing rooms and the makeup trailers. Shannen and Luke were exhausted, overworked, and completely focused on carrying the emotional weight of the series. They did not fully realize that the people they worked with every single day were beginning to view their success not as a victory for the whole team, but as a direct threat to their own careers. The network had successfully turned Shannen and Luke into global icons, but in doing so, they had accidentally painted a massive target squarely on their backs. The stage was set for a brutal, calculated workplace rebellion, and the sanctuary they had built for each other was about to be violently torn apart. As the calendar turned to 1992, the massive, unprecedented success of Beverly Hills, 90210, created a highly dangerous problem for the executives at the Fox network. In the corporate television industry, popularity is a double-edged sword. The network had successfully used the intense, authentic romance between Brenda Walsh and Dylan McKay, yield a billion-dollar empire. Shannen Doherty and Luke Perry had become global superstars. But for the men in the executive boardrooms, this level of concentrated star power was a massive financial liability. If two actors hold the absolute key to a show's success, they hold the power to demand massive salary increases. They hold the power to dictate the shooting schedule. The network executives looked at the ratings data and realized they were entirely hostage to the chemistry of Shannen and Luke. Furthermore, the rest of the ensemble cast, particularly those with deep protected family connections to the billionaire producer Aaron Spelling, were growing increasingly bitter about their lack of screen time. The corporate machine realized they needed to fundamentally restructure the power dynamic on the soundstage. They needed to dilute the power of their two biggest stars. To achieve this, the networks did not use contract negotiations. They used the script. They executed a deliberate, highly calculated narrative hijacking. The writing staff was handed a strict corporate mandate. They had to break apart the relationship between Brenda and Dylan. They were ordered to introduce a classic manipulative television trope, a love triangle. The writers were instructed to force Dylan to cheat on Brenda with her best friend. This was not a decision based on organic storytelling or artistic integrity. It was a cold mathematical strategy designed to redistribute the screen time and artificially inflate the importance of the other actors. By tearing Brenda and Dylan apart, the network could force the audience to focus on different characters, thereby breaking the monopoly that Shannen and Luke held over the entire production. For Shannen Doherty and Luke Perry, this corporate mandate was a profound professional betrayal. When they received the new scripts in early 1992, the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. They had spent 2 years working exhausting, 16-hour days to carefully build a relationship that felt entirely real to the viewing public. They had invested their own emotional energy into making Brenda and Dylan a symbol of loyalty and deep connection. Now they were being ordered to actively destroy their own creation. Shannen Doherty was not a passive employee. She possessed a deep understanding of character logic and narrative structure. When she read the scripts dictating that Brenda would be casually betrayed by the two people she trusted most, Shannen fought back. She walked directly into the production offices and confronted the writers. She argued that the storyline completely assassinated the core identity of Brenda Walsh. She pointed out that it was entirely illogical for a smart, strong-willed character to be subjected to such a humiliating, contrived plot simply to give another actress more time in front of the cameras. But her professional arguments were completely ignored. The Hollywood system does not care about character logic. It cares about corporate strategy. The executives looked at a young, hard-working actress and completely dismissed her artistic input. They rigidly reminded her of her legal contract. They made it absolutely clear that she was not a collaborator. She was a hired employee. Her job was to stand on the mark, say the lines she was given, and act out the deliberate destruction of her own character without complaining. This is where the true psychological trauma of the television contract begins to suffocate an actor. Shannen was entirely trapped. She could not quit the show without facing massive career-ending lawsuits. She was legally forced to show up to work every single morning and perform a script that was actively designed to humiliate her character and diminish her value to the series. She had to stand under the hot studio lights and film highly emotional scenes where she was betrayed, all while knowing that the betrayal on the screen was a direct reflection of corporate betrayal happening in the executive boardrooms. Luke Perry found himself trapped in an equally impossible position. He was deeply loyal to Shannen. He knew exactly what the network was trying to do. He recognized that the news scripts were weak, contrived, and heavily driven by backstage politics rather than good television. He absolutely hated the direction his character was being forced to take. Dylan McKay was originally written as a man of deep principles, a protector. Now, the network was forcing Luke to play a dishonest, manipulative teenager simply to facilitate a corporate restructuring. But Luke was also bound by a strict, long-term legal contract. He could not refuse to film the scenes. He tried to use his massive popularity to buffer Shannen from the worst of the executive pressure. During the rehearsals, he would quietly argue with the directors to soften the dialogue or change the blocking to make the scenes less humiliating for her. He became a reluctant diplomat, constantly trying to negotiate peace between a highly aggressive television network and a leading lady who was being systematically pushed to her absolute breaking point. The physical and emotional exhaustion of this environment began to heavily bleed into their daily lives. The soundstage, which had once been a place of creative energy and shared success, transformed into a hostile, deeply uncomfortable factory. When Shannen and Luke had to film the scenes where their characters broke up, the tension in the room was suffocating. They were no longer just acting out a teenage romance ending. They were acting out the death of the very thing that had made them stars. The cameras captured the genuine heavy sadness and frustration in their eyes, but the audience at home misinterpreted it as brilliant acting. The viewers did not realize they were watching two completely exhausted young professionals being ground down by a ruthless corporate machine. As 1992 dragged into 1993, the continuous daily disrespect from the producers began to trigger a severe trauma response in Shannen Doherty. When a human being is trapped in a hostile workplace, surrounded by colleagues who actively resent them, and managed by executives who deliberately sabotage their work, they do not simply smile and remain perfectly compliant. They rebel. Shannen felt entirely powerless over the script and her career trajectory, so she began to assert control in the only way she could. Her behavior on the set became increasingly defensive and erratic. She started arriving late for early morning call times. She refused to blindly accept terrible direction, frequently engaging in loud, direct arguments with the directors on the studio floor. She stopped trying to be polite to the ensemble cast members who were actively benefiting from her character's destruction. She isolated herself completely, putting up a massive, impenetrable wall of hostility to protect herself from a system that was constantly attacking her. In any standard corporate environment, a manager would look at a high-performing employee exhibiting these stress behaviors and pull them aside for a supportive conversation. They would investigate the root cause of the tension. But the Hollywood system operates on absolute cruelty. The network executives did not try to help Shannen. They actively weaponized her trauma against her. They used her defensive behavior as the perfect excuse to justify their ongoing sabotage. They began quietly leaking stories to the tabloid press. The Hollywood public relations machine is incredibly powerful, and the network used it to paint Shannen Doherty as an out-of-control, difficult diva. They fed the media a highly curated narrative, claiming that she was ruining the atmosphere on the set. They completely omitted the fact that she was reacting to a sustained campaign of corporate bullying and script manipulation. Luke Perry had to watch this public assassination of his co-star's character in real time. He was the only person on the set who fully understood the immense psychological pressure she was carrying. He knew that the woman the press was calling a monster was actually a dedicated, exhausted actress who was simply trying to survive a completely toxic workplace. He tried to defend her behind closed doors, pleading with the producers to ease the pressure and fix the scripts. He warned them that they were destroying the very foundation of the series. But his warnings were entirely ignored. The network executives had successfully created a massive division on the soundstage. The ensemble cast, feeling empowered by the network's backing and the shift in the storyline, began to openly turn against Shannen. The private sanctuary that Shannen and Luke had built together in the corner of the studio was completely invaded by the toxic politics of the production. They were no longer just fighting the writers. They were fighting the entire corporate structure of the Fox network. The stress of the situation began to fracture the joy they found in the work. When they were forced to film scenes together, the old electric chemistry was buried under layers of deep, unspoken exhaustion. They would hit their marks, deliver their lines perfectly, and the exact second the director yelled, "Cut," the heavy, cold reality of their situation would crash back down on them. They were two highly paid, globally famous hostages, locked in a multi-billion-dollar cage, completely aware that the people holding the keys were actively planning a final ruthless execution. The workplace rebellion was failing, and the corporate machine was preparing to deliver the fatal blow to Brenda Walsh. By 1993, the atmosphere on the soundstage had moved past standard workplace tension. It had devolved into an active, highly organized corporate coup. The Fox network executives had successfully planted the seeds of division by rewriting the scripts to BR. Eke apart Brenda and Dylan, they had empowered the supporting cast by giving them the screen time that originally belonged to the main couple. But the network underestimated exactly how far that supporting cast would go once they tasted that power. The environment surrounding Shannen Doherty and Luke Perry became a masterclass in psychological isolation. In the television industry, power is rarely about who has the most talent or who brings in the highest ratings. True power in Hollywood frequently relies on who your family is. The supporting cast included actors with direct, undeniable blood ties to the absolute top of the corporate ladder, specifically the daughter of the show's billionaire creator. When you work on a set where a coworker goes home and eats dinner with the man who signs your paychecks, normal workplace rules do not exist. You are not operating in a meritocracy. You are operating in a monarchy. The supporting actors, tired of living in the massive shadow of the Brenda and Dylan phenomenon, realized they had the ultimate trump card. They did not need to negotiate with directors or writers. They could simply bypass the entire chain of command. They quietly organized a backstage alliance, an unspoken union of resentment specifically designed to completely remove Shannen Doherty from the television show. They recognized that Shannen was exhausted, defensive, and completely worn down by the daily corporate bullying. Instead of offering professional support to a struggling colleague, they decided to strike the final blow. They organized a secret meeting and essentially delivered an ultimatum to the production company. The message was clear and completely ruthless. The rest of the cast was refusing to work with Shannen anymore. They threatened a silent mutiny. If the executives did not remove her, the daily production of the billion-dollar show would grind to a halt. For Luke Perry, watching this coup unfold was a deeply sickening experience. He was a working-class actor who fundamentally believed in the work. He had spent years building a profound, trusting professional partnership with Shannen. He knew her deeply. He knew she was not the villain the media was portraying. She was a young woman suffering a severe stress response to an impossibly cruel workplace. But he was completely outmaneuvered. The alliance against her was anchored by deep-rooted nepotism. Luke possessed massive public popularity, but public popularity cannot defeat a direct phone call from a producer's daughter to the boss. Luke was legally bound to the network. He could not organize a counterstrike without breaching his own ironclad contract and facing financial ruin. He was forced to stand on the studio floor and watch his scene partner, his closest ally in the Hollywood machine, be systematically cornered and destroyed by people who had actively benefited from the very audience she had helped build. The breaking point did not happen in a quiet boardroom. It happened directly on the set. Shannen's exhaustion and defensive behavior had evolved into chronic lateness. She frequently delayed early morning productions, which cost the studio significant amounts of money. The daily tension finally exploded into a highly publicized physical altercation with co-star Jenny Garth. This specific incident gave the Backstage Alliance the perfect legal ammunition. The creator of the show, Aaron Spelling, listened to the cast's ultimatum. Despite Brenda Walsh being the foundational pillar of the show, the network cited unprofessional conduct and fired her. The way the network handled her actual exit from the series in 1994 is one of the most disrespectful acts of corporate storytelling in television history. When a show has spent 4 years convincing millions of viewers to deeply invest in a central romance, they owe the audience a proper conclusion. But the network executives were not interested in art, and they certainly were not interested in giving Shannen a respectful farewell. They wanted her out of the building as fast as possible. The writers were ordered to quickly and quietly dispose of Brenda Walsh. They did not give Brenda and Dylan a beautiful, tragic, or meaningful final storyline. They simply wrote a rushed, incredibly hollow script where Brenda abruptly decides to move to London to attend drama school. Imagine the reality of filming those final scenes. Shannen Doherty was handed a script that essentially fired her on camera. She had to stand under the lights, look at Luke Perry, and act out a completely rushed, emotionally empty goodbye. She was forced to say farewell to the character she had built, the romance that defined her career, and the only co-star who had actually tried to protect her. She had to do it while surrounded by a crew and a supporting cast who had actively conspired to have her thrown off the studio lot. Luke Perry had to endure the sheer professional humiliation of acting out that lie. He had to look into Shannen's eyes and pretend that this rushed departure made narrative sense. The script demanded that Dylan simply let Brenda go, wrapping up a 4-year, billion-dollar love story in a matter of minutes. The heavy, dark sadness visible on their faces during those final scenes was not acting. It was the raw, unvarnished trauma of two professionals realizing they had completely lost. The corporation had won. When the episode aired, the betrayal of the viewing public was absolute. Millions of people sitting in their living rooms watched their favorite female lead get shoved onto a plane with barely a second thought. The audience had invested hundreds of hours into caring about Brenda and Dylan. They had bought the merchandise, boosted the ratings, and generated the massive advertising revenue that made the network executives rich. In return, the network handed them a cheap, insulting exit that made absolutely no logical sense. The executives successfully executed Brenda Walsh. They completely severed the main artery of their own show simply to satisfy a workplace grudge. Shannen Doherty was escorted out of the Beverly Hills zip code, leaving behind a massive empty void on the soundstage. But the corporation severely miscalculated the fallout. They assumed they could just plug another actress into the formula, pair her up with Luke Perry, and the money machine would keep printing. They fundamentally failed to understand that the audience was not in love with the script. The audience was in love with the specific, irreplaceable human chemistry between Shannen and Luke. By destroying the woman, they had accidentally but permanently destroyed the man left behind. The immediate aftermath of Shannen Doherty's sudden departure in the summer of 1994 created a massive public relations nightmare for the Fox network. The executives had successfully purged their soundstage, but they now faced a furious viewing public. Millions of fans were demanding to know why the heart of the show had been ripped out. To protect their billion-dollar asset and completely shield the backstage nepotism from public scrutiny, the Hollywood machine did what it does best. They launched a ruthless, highly coordinated smear campaign. The corporate public relations teams went into overdrive. They aggressively leaked heavily biased stories to every major tabloid and entertainment magazine in the country. They systematically rewrote the narrative of the last 4 years. In the press, Shannen was no longer the exhausted, overworked young woman who had been bullied by a toxic workplace alliance. The network actively branded her as an unstable, aggressive diva. They painted her as a workplace menace who was entirely impossible to manage. They assassinated her character in the media so that the audience would view her firing not as a corporate injustice, but as a necessary relief. The executives deliberately shifted the blame entirely onto the victim to protect the fragile egos of the actors who remained on the payroll. For Luke Perry, the months following Shannen's exit were an exercise in profound psychological torture. He had to sit in total silence and watch the Hollywood press completely destroy the reputation of his closest friend and most trusted colleague. He knew the absolute truth. He knew she had been cornered and forced out by a toxic alliance of family privilege. But Luke was entirely gagged by the network. His television contract contained strict non-disparagement clauses. If he went to the press and told the truth in her defense, the Fox networks would unleash their corporate lawyers and completely destroy his financial future. He was trapped inside the very machine that was actively crushing his friend. Every time a reporter asked him about Shannen's departure, he was legally forced to give vague, neutral answers. He could not express his genuine anger. The corporate system forced a loyal, principled man to swallow his own integrity. This is the deeply hidden trauma of the Hollywood contract. It does not just control your working hours, it completely controls your voice. The forced silence slowly ate away at Luke. He went to work every morning carrying the heavy guilt of a survivor, knowing that the people smiling at him in the makeup trailer were the exact same people who had orchestrated the cowardly coup against his scene partner. As 1994 bled into 1995, the network executives desperately tried to maintain the illusion that the show could survive without Brenda Walsh. They fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their own success. They believed that Luke Perry's massive popularity was enough to carry the ratings, and that they could simply plug him into a new romantic storyline with one of the remaining actresses. They actively forced his character Dylan McKay into highly contrived, artificial relationships with the exact same women who had conspired to get Shannen fired. Resulting television was completely hollow. When Luke stood under the studio lights and tried to act out these new corporate-mandated romances, the screen went entirely cold. There was no spark. There was no authentic working-class connection. He was reciting lines from a script, but the deep, unspoken trust that had defined his scenes with Shannen was permanently gone. The audience sitting at home instantly recognized the fake dynamic. You cannot manufacture genuine human chemistry in a boardroom, and you certainly cannot force a man to generate on-screen passion with the people who had just ruined his workplace. The ratings began to reflect this hollow reality. The massive cultural grip the show held over the public began to slip rapidly. The viewers were not easily fooled. They felt the massive void left by Brenda Walsh. For Luke, the daily grind of filming became deeply depressing. He was no longer playing the principled, complex character he had helped to build. He realized he was now just being used as a highly paid prop to boost the screen time of the remaining cast members. The network had completely stripped away the only narrative anchor that made his job meaningful. He looked around the soundstage and finally saw the television machine for exactly what it was. It was a cold, ruthless factory that rewarded backstage manipulation and actively punished authentic talent. The soul of the program had been violently amputated, and Luke knew he could not stay in that toxic environment much longer without losing his own mind. He was tired of reading weak scripts. He was tired of acting opposite people he fundamentally did not respect. He was tired of the heavy silence. The corporate plot to destroy Brenda Walsh had succeeded, but in doing so, the network had completely broken the spirit of their leading man. The countdown to his own inevitable exit had officially begun. By the spring of 1995, the massive soundstage of Beverly Hills 90210 had completely transformed from a creative workplace into a highly lucrative psychological cage for Luke Perry. The Fox network executives believed they had successfully navigated the crisis. They had purged Shannen Doherty from the building, successfully smeared her reputation in the media, and aggressively marketed the remaining cast to the public. They looked at their corporate spreadsheets and assumed that their leading man would simply fall in line. They assumed that the massive amounts of money they were paying him would act as a permanent blindfold to the cruelty he had just witnessed. They were completely wrong. The physical reality of going to work every single day had become a soul-crushing exercise for Luke. When a television production removes a primary character, they do not just remove an actor, they remove the entire context that made the surrounding characters make sense. For 4 years, Dylan McKay was defined by his deep protective bond with Brenda Walsh. She was his anchor. Without her, the writers had absolutely no idea what to do with him. They began throwing highly contrived, ridiculous storylines at him, trying desperately to generate the massive ratings they had casually thrown away. Luke was forced to sit in his dressing room every morning and read scripts that completely insulted his intelligence. The network ordered him to act out melodramatic, highly exaggerated plots that belonged in a cheap daytime soap opera, not the groundbreaking teenage drama he had helped to build. He was asked to generate intense romantic passion with the exact same supporting cast members who had organized the secret backstage coup against Shannen. This is the deeply hidden, unvarnished trauma of the Hollywood system. It forces a human being to completely suppress their own moral compass to satisfy a legal contract. Luke Perry was a man of strong, working-class principles. He valued loyalty. He despised the toxic nepotism that ran the studio lot. Yet, the network legally said him to stand under the bright studio lights, look into the eyes of the people who had betrayed his closest colleague, and pretend to love them for the cameras. Every single time the director yelled action, Luke was forced to actively betray his own integrity, just to avoid a massive breach of contract lawsuit. The exhaustion of living this double life began to show on the screen. The viewers sitting at home began to notice a profound shift in their favorite leading man. The dangerous magnetic energy that had made Dylan McKay a cultural icon was completely gone. In its place was a heavy, cold apathy. Luke was no longer acting. He was simply surviving the shooting schedule. He would hit his marks on the floor, deliver his dialogue with a flat, mechanical tone, and immediately walk off the set the second the scene was over. He completely withdrew from the corporate machine. The network executives, watching the daily footage from the safety of their boardrooms, finally began to panic. They realized that the psychological torture they had inflicted on their set was actively destroying their most valuable remaining asset. But instead of apologizing, instead of admitting that firing Shannen was a catastrophic narrative mistake, they doubled down on their corporate pressure. They called Luke into tense high-level meetings. They demanded that he smile more. They demanded that he bring the old Dylan back to the screen. They tried to use guilt, reminding him of his massive salary and his obligation to the network. But Luke Perry was no longer intimidated by the executives. The sudden, brutal firing of Shannen Doherty had acted as a massive wake-up call. He had watched the corporation completely destroy the career of a young, talented woman simply because she became inconvenient to the family power structure. He realized with absolute clarity that the network had zero loyalty to him either. The multi-million-dollar corporation did not view him as a human being. They viewed him strictly as inventory. If he stayed, they would simply continue to drain his energy, ruin his character's legacy, and use his face to sell advertising space until he was completely empty. By the summer of 1995, Luke Perry made a decisive professional choice. He did not just want to escape the backstage politics. He wanted to pursue mature roles in feature films. He instructed his legal team to initiate the process of leaving his contract. The network was already bleeding viewers following Brenda's exit. Fearing a public legal battle that could further damage the franchise, they eventually agreed to let him go. When a major television star attempts to leave a highly rated show before their contract expires, the network does not simply let them walk away. The Hollywood machine actively fights to keep its property. The corporate lawyers immediately threatened Luke with severe financial penalties. They used the exact same intimidation tactics they had used against Shannen. They threatened to tie him up in endless litigation, freeze his career, and destroy his reputation in the press. But Luke held a distinct advantage that Shannen did not. He was the undisputed male lead, and the network was already bleeding viewers following Brenda's exit. The executives knew that if they dragged Luke into a massive public legal battle, the entire billion-dollar franchise would instantly collapse. The audience was already furious. A public war with their remaining idol would be corporate suicide. Furthermore, the deeply ingrained sexism of the Hollywood public relations machine meant the network could not successfully brand Luke as a crazy diva, the way they had branded Shannen. The standard smear tactic simply would not work on him. Faced with a leading man who was entirely willing to walk away from the money and completely unafraid of their legal threats, the Fox network was forced to surrender. In the autumn of 1995, they officially agreed to let him go. When Luke filmed his final scene for season 6, his character rode a motorcycle off the lot. For Luke, it was a genuine escape to pursue movies like The Fifth Element. However, the Hollywood machine is deeply complicated. Financial realities and new contract negotiations would actually bring him back to the series 3 years later in season 9. But that initial departure in '95 permanently severed the show's original magic. The moment Luke Perry's motorcycle disappeared from the screen, the golden era of Beverly Hills 90210 was officially dead. The network had successfully protected their backstage nepotism and the fragile egos of their supporting cast. But the victory was completely hollow. By ruthlessly plotting to destroy Brenda Walsh, the executives had completely destroyed the structural foundation of their own empire. They had forced out the only two actors who brought genuine, authentic human connection to the soundstage. What remained on the screen for the next 5 years was a mindless corporate zombie, a show completely devoid of its original soul, kept alive by artificial life support, simply to satisfy international syndication deals. The departure of Luke Perry in the autumn of 1995 completely severed the final lingering connection to the show's original magic. The Fox network kept the cameras rolling for several more years, stubbornly refusing to admit defeat. They continued to broadcast episodes under the banner of Beverly Hills 90210, but the product they were delivering to the public was completely unrecognizable. It had devolved into a hollow mechanical soap opera. The executives had successfully secured the studio lot for the producer's daughter and the backstage alliance, but in doing so, they had actively destroyed the very soul of their own property. When we look back at the legacy of Brenda Walsh and Dylan McKay, we have to separate the fictional storyline from the cold industrial reality of how televisio and is actually manufactured. The romance between those two characters left an absolutely permanent mark on the history of pop culture. To this day, they remain the definitive blueprint for teenage television drama. But their enduring legacy was not created by the writers in the boardroom. It was created entirely by the raw, unpolished, working-class authenticity that Shannen, Doherty, and Luke Perry dragged onto the soundstage with them every single morning. They succeeded because they brought genuine human truth into a highly artificial environment. The tragedy is that this exact authenticity is what made them immediate targets for corporate termination. The story of how this massive television empire fractured is the ultimate, undeniable proof of how family privilege and nepotism operate in Hollywood. It teaches a brutal, unforgiving lesson about the reality of the entertainment industry, talent, dedication, and the overwhelming support of the viewing public will always be forced to bow to backstage power alliances.